December 19th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. The German 2nd Panzer Division was used to winning. They were the Vienna Division, a veteran force equipped with the pride of the Wehrmacht, the Panther tank. To a Panther crew, the war was a series of mathematical certainties. They had 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor. They had the KWK 42 75mm gun, a weapon that could core an American Sherman from 2 kilometers away. But as they pushed toward the vital crossroads of Bastogne, specifically the small village of Noville, the math stopped working. Reports began flooding back to the 2nd Panzer's headquarters that were bordering on the hysterical. German commanders were told they were facing a massive Allied counter-offensive. They reported seeing clutches of tanks appearing and disappearing like mountain mist. One moment, a Panther would be advancing down a narrow, frozen lane. The next, a shell would slam into its thin side armor from an alleyway. By the time the German gunner could even begin to crank his heavy turret, the attacker was gone. 30 seconds later, that same ghost would fire from a ridge 300 yards behind them. German intelligence logged a terrifying conclusion. They had encountered an entire American armored division. They believed they were being surrounded by hundreds of tanks. They were wrong. They weren't fighting a division. They were fighting a handful of 18-ton cardboard boxes on tracks. These were the men of the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and they were operating a vehicle that shouldn't have worked on a modern battlefield. It had no armor. It had an open roof that invited grenades and rain. But it had one thing the Germans had never accounted for. It was faster than the gears of their own machines. This is the story of how a failed American doctrine and a vehicle the army tried to cancel multiple times ended up breaking the back of the German Panzer Corps. To understand how the Hellcat broke the Panzers in 1944, we have to go back to the panic of 1941. Before the United States even entered the war, they watched from the sidelines as the German blitzkrieg tore through Poland and France. The American High Command was terrified. Their own tanks, like the early M3 Lee, were tall, awkward, and outclassed. The army realized that if they ever faced the Wehrmacht, their standard tanks would be slaughtered. Enter Andrew Davis Bruce. In 1941, Bruce was a lieutenant colonel with a radical, almost suicidal idea. He was tasked with leading the newly formed Tank Destroyer Center at Camp Hood, Texas. Bruce looked at the German Panzers, these monsters of steel, and realized that trying to out-armor them was a losing game. If the Germans built a tank with 4 inches of steel, the Americans would build one with 5. Then the Germans would build one with 6. It was a race toward heavy, slow, lumbering targets. Bruce proposed a different path. He wanted a puncher, not a slugger. He famously said that the job of a tank destroyer was to seek, strike, and destroy. But the unspoken part of that motto was, don't get hit. He envisioned a vehicle that was essentially a massive gun mounted on the fastest possible chassis. He wanted something that could move like a sports car but hit like a freight train. The Army's old guard hated it. They argued that a tank without armor was just a motorized coffin. And on paper, they were right. But Bruce had identified a flaw in German engineering that no one else was talking about: the turret traverse. Here is the deadly math that the Germans never solved. A tank is only as dangerous as the direction its gun is pointing. If an enemy is at your 12 o'clock, you are a god. If an enemy is at your 3 o'clock, you are a victim. until you can turn that turret. The German Panther and the Tiger were masterpieces of protection, but they were slaves to their engines. In a Tiger I, the turret was rotated by a hydraulic system geared directly to the main engine. To turn the turret quickly, the driver had to rev the engine to high RPMs. At full throttle, 3000 RPM, a Tiger turret could pull a 360-degree turn in about 60 seconds. At combat idle, where most tanks actually sit during a fight, that same rotation could take up to 4 minutes. If the engine died, or if the hydraulics took a hit, the crew had to use a manual hand crank. To move the gun just one full circle, the loader had to turn a wheel 720 times. Andrew Bruce realized that if he could build a vehicle that could travel 50 miles per hour, it would literally be moving faster than the German gunners could math. If a Hellcat started at a Panther's front and raced toward its side, the German gunner would be frantically cranking a handle or screaming for the driver to rev the engine, only to watch the Hellcat disappear behind a building before the gun could even level. Bruce wasn't just building a tank destroyer, he was weaponizing geometry. In 1942, the project was handed to an unlikely savior, the Buick Motor Division of General Motors. Buick didn't want to build a tractor. They wanted to build a racer. They brought in Harley Earl, the legendary automotive designer who would later give us the sleek curves of the 1950s Corvettes and Cadillacs. The result was the T-70 prototype, which would become the M18 Hellcat. It was a mechanical marvel. The first factor was the weight. While a Panther weighed 45 tons and a Tiger weighed 57, the Hellcat weighed a mere 18 tons. Then there was the engine. They took a Wright R975 radial aircraft engine, the same massive 400 horsepower heart used in the Sherman, and stuffed it into a body half the Sherman's weight. Finally, there was the armor, or the lack thereof. To get that speed, they stripped the armor down to 13 millimeters. When the first crews saw the M18, they were horrified. 13 millimeters is barely half an inch. A standard German infantry rifle, firing an armor-piercing round, could theoretically punch through the side of a Hellcat. A German 75mm or 88mm shell wouldn't just hit a Hellcat. It would pass through one side and out the other, turning everything inside into shrapnel. The crews joked that the 18 in M18 stood for the number of seconds they expected to live in combat. But Buick gave them a secret weapon. They didn't just give it a fast engine, they gave it the most advanced torsion bar suspension of the war. This allowed the Hellcat to maintain its top speed of 55 miles per hour even over rough, muddy terrain. The math was now set. The Germans had the armor, the Americans had the speed. And in the winter of 1944, these two philosophies were about to collide in the bloodiest valley in Europe. When the first Hellcats arrived in the European theatre, they weren't greeted with parades. They were greeted with skepticism that bordered on contempt. To the average infantryman, a tank was supposed to be a shield. But the men of the Tank Destroyer Battalions were being taught a different, more lethal doctrine. They were being told that their shield was made of air and distance. Andrew Bruce's training centres at Camp Hood didn't just teach gunnery, they taught aggression. The crews were drilled to act like cavalry, not infantry. They were taught the sidestep, If a German tank appeared, the instruction was clear. Do not stop. Do not aim for the front. Put the pedal to the floor, flank until you see the grey painted side of the hull, fire, and keep driving. It was a high-stakes gamble that required a specific kind of soldier, someone who preferred a fast car to a safe house. And as 1944 progressed, these speed freaks of the armoured world were about to prove that a thin skin was a small price to pay for the ability to dictate the terms of a fight. The true test of the Hellcats' break the Panzers philosophy didn't just happen in the snow of Belgium. It happened in the wide-open rat race of the Po Valley in Italy. In April 1945, the 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion found themselves in the perfect environment for the M18. The Italian mountains had finally given way to the flat, billiard table plains of the north. The German army was in full retreat, trying to scramble across the Po River before the Allied tide could swallow them. This was not a slow, grinding battle. This was a chase. The 805th crews, sporting their unauthorized black cat patches, did something that horrified German tacticians. They didn't just pursue the German columns from behind. They pulled into the passing lane. Moving at speeds of 40 and 50 miles per hour, Hellcats would race parallel to retreating German convoys. On the roads were Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, and hundreds of supply trucks. To the German gunners, it was a nightmare. A Panther would be lumbering north at 15 miles per hour. Suddenly, out of the dust to their left, an M18 would appear, moving 3 times their speed. By the time the German commander could scream, "Left! Target! 9 o'clock!" the Hellcat had already travelled 100 yards. The German gunner would frantically crank his turret, trying to lead the target. But the M18 wasn't just a target. It was a ghost. It would fire its 76mm high-velocity gun while on the move, or during a brief pop stop, punch a hole through the thin side armour of the Panther, and be another 200 yards down the road before the German shell could even leave the barrel. It was armoured drive-by shooting on a massive scale. The German intelligence reports from this period reflect a total breakdown in comprehension. They kept reporting massive Allied armoured thrusts in multiple locations simultaneously. They couldn't believe a single battalion was causing this much chaos. The speed of the M18 had created a force multiplier effect. Because a Hellcat could be in 3 different engagements in a single hour, the Germans believed they were being hunted by a force 10 times its actual size. The adrenaline of the rat race was intoxicating, but it masked a terrifying reality. In the M18, speed was your only armour. If a Hellcat's track hit a mine, it was a death trap. If a driver hesitated for 3 seconds at a crossroads, a German anti-tank crew would turn that 13mm of steel into a colander. This was the glass cannon in its purest form. And nowhere was the fragility of the Hellcat more apparent than in the story of the 705th back in the Ardennes. While the 805th was enjoying the open plains of Italy, the men in the fog of Noville were discovering the dark side of the M18's design. The open-top turret, designed to give the crew 360-degree visibility and save weight, became a magnet for death. In the close-quarters fighting of the village, German infantry were firing from the second stories of houses, tossing grenades directly into the open compartments of the Hellcats. Freezing rain and sleet filled the turrets. The crews were numb, wet, and exposed. They were fighting in a vehicle designed for the wide-open plains of Texas in a cramped, vertical, urban nightmare. And yet, it was here that the Hellcats' broken geometry saved the day. Colonel Clifford Templeton, commanding the 705th, knew his men couldn't stand and fight. He ordered a fluid defense. A Hellcat would sit behind a stone barn, engine idling. A Panther would creep into the square. The Hellcat would dart out, fire at the Panther's flank, and immediately throw the transmission into reverse. The M18 was one of the few vehicles of the war with a dedicated reverse gear that allowed it to move nearly 20 miles per hour backwards. The German Panther crews were baffled. They would fire at where the American tank should have been, only to hit the stone wall the Hellcat had just vacated. To the Germans, it felt like fighting a boxer who refused to stay in the ring. You couldn't hit what you couldn't catch, and you couldn't catch what you couldn't even see for more than 5 seconds at a time. By the end of the 2-day engagement at Noville, the 705th, a fragile unit of tank destroyers, had helped destroy over 30 German tanks, most of them heavy Panthers. They had stalled the 2nd Panzer Division long enough for the 101st Airborne to dig into the hills of Bastogne. The math had held. The cardboard tank had broken the steel monster. But the war wasn't over, and the Germans were beginning to realize that if they couldn't turn their turrets fast enough to hit the Hellcat, they would have to find another way to kill it. They started aiming for the one thing the Hellcat couldn't outrun: the terrain itself. As the war dragged into its final months, the Germans began to realize that the M18 Hellcat wasn't playing by the established rules of armored warfare. In the traditional playbook, tanks moved in columns, supported each other with heavy frontal fire, and relied on their thick hides to soak up punishment. The Hellcat, however, played the game like a predatory animal. It didn't want a fair fight. It wanted an execution. To counter this, German commanders tried to force the Hellcat into static engagements. They knew that if they could pin an M18 down, force it into a narrow mountain pass or a debris-clogged street where it couldn't use its 55-mile-per-hour speed, the math of survival would flip in their favor. In a stationary duel, a 13mm thick Hellcat stood 0 chance against a Tiger. But this led to a psychological breakdown within the German Panzer Corps. Tankers who had once felt invincible behind 4 inches of Krupp steel were now terrified of empty space. They began to realize that every hedgerow, every barn, and every dip in the terrain could hide a vehicle that was technically lighter than their own supply trucks, but packed a 76mm punch that could end their lives in a heartbeat. The Germans began to call the M18 the Grey Ghost. This fear changed how the Panzers operated. German commanders grew hesitant. They stopped advancing with the reckless confidence of the early war years. Every time they spotted a single Hellcat, they assumed 5 more were racing toward their rear. The Hellcat was breaking the German Panzer Corps, not just physically, but mentally. Inside the Hellcat, the experience was just as intense. To drive an M18 was to live in a state of constant, high-octane vibration. The Wright R975 radial engine was originally designed to pull an airplane through the sky. Inside the cramped metal hull of the Hellcat, it sounded like a continuous explosion. The heat was immense. The smell of high-octane fuel was ever present, and the lack of a roof meant the crew was never truly inside. They were part of the landscape, feeling the bite of the wind and the spray of the mud. This openness created a unique bond among Hellcat crews. Unlike Sherman crews, who were entombed in a steel box, Hellcat men felt like they were riding a wild horse. They became famous for their black cat swagger. They knew they were driving the most fragile vehicle in the theatre, and that knowledge bred a brand of dark humour and elite confidence. They weren't tankers, they were tank destroyers. The difference was more than just a name. A tanker's job was to hold ground. A tank destroyer's job was to kill. This aggressive spirit culminated in the Great Pursuit across France and into Germany. As the Allied lines broke out from Normandy, the Hellcats were unleashed. While the heavy Shermans struggled with the narrow lanes of the bocage, the Hellcats found every gap, every goat path, and every bridge that was too weak for a 30-ton tank, but just right for an 18-ton racer. They were consistently 20, 30, even 50 miles ahead of the main Allied advance. This created a logistical nightmare for the Germans. German officers would be sitting in a French chateau miles behind the front lines, eating dinner, only to have a Hellcat roar into the courtyard, fire a round into the command vehicles, and disappear before the guards could even reach for their rifles. It was the ultimate realization of Andrew Bruce's vision. The Hellcat was a scalpel, cutting the nerves of the German war machine. But the most significant impact the Hellcat had on the Panzer Corps wasn't the individual tanks it destroyed. It was the tyranny of geometry it imposed on German design. The Germans responded to the Hellcat and the high-velocity Allied guns by making their tanks even heavier, even slower, and even more cumbersome. They built the King Tiger and the Jag Tiger, monsters of 70 and 80 tons. By doing so, they played right into the Hellcats' hands. The heavier the German tanks became, the more they relied on those slow hydraulic turrets. The more they relied on those turrets, the easier it was for a Hellcat to outmath them. The German Panzer Corps was literally crushing itself under the weight of its own armor, trying to protect itself from a ghost that moved at 44 feet per second. The M18 Hellcat had turned the greatest strength of the German army, its heavy armor, into its greatest liability. In the end, the Panther and the Tiger were masters of a war that no longer existed. The Hellcat had ushered in the era of the high-mobility strike, proving that in the hands of a skilled crew, speed wasn't just a way to get to the battle. It was the deadliest weapon on the field. By the spring of 1945, the German Panzer Corps wasn't just losing a war of attrition, it was losing a war of movement. The math of survival that had started as a theory in a Texas training camp had become a brutal daily reality on the road to Berlin. The M18 Hellcat had achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any armoured vehicle in the American arsenal, a staggering 2.4 to 1. In some battalions, that number was even higher. But as the smoke cleared, a new debate began to emerge among the top brass. If the Hellcat was so successful, why was the army already planning its retirement? The answer lay in the very thing that made the Hellcat a legend: its specialization. The M18 was a precision instrument, a glass cannon, designed for a very specific type of warfare. As the Allies moved deeper into the heart of Germany, the nature of the fighting changed. The wide-open rat races of the Po Valley and the plains of France were replaced by rubble warfare. In the shattered streets of Cologne and Nuremberg, speed mattered less than raw staying power. A Hellcat couldn't outflank a hidden anti-tank gun tucked into a basement. It couldn't outrun a sniper's bullet or a Panzerfaust fired from a sewer grate. In these tight, claustrophobic spaces, the Hellcat's 13 millimeters of armor felt less like a lightweight advantage and more like a death sentence. The crews began to feel the weight of their own vulnerability. After months of betting their lives on speed, the sheer statistical probability of getting hit started to catch up with them. Historians like Steven Zaloga have often pointed out that the Hellcat's success might have been more about the men than the machine. The crews of the Tank Destroyer Battalions were elite, highly trained specialists. They were taught to see the battlefield in 3 dimensions. They weren't just drivers, they were tacticians. Zaloga argued that these men might have been successful in any vehicle. But the men who lived in those open turrets disagreed. They knew that a Sherman couldn't have made the reverse speed jumps at Noville. They knew a heavy Pershing couldn't have pulled into the passing lane in the Po Valley. The Hellcat didn't just carry the men into battle. It gave them a vocabulary of movement that no other tank in the world possessed. When the war ended in May 1945, the M18 Hellcat was almost immediately phased out of service. The United States Army decided to abandon the Tank Destroyer Doctrine entirely. The future, they decided, belonged to the main battle tank, a vehicle that tried to do everything: heavy armor, heavy guns, and moderate speed. The era of the unarmored racer seemed to be over. But the lesson the Hellcat taught the German Panzer Corps was never forgotten. The Germans had built the most feared tanks in history, monsters of engineering that could win any head-on fight. But the Hellcat proved that a head-on fight is a choice. By refusing to play by the rules of slugging matches, the M18 broke the fundamental logic of the Wehrmacht's armored doctrine. They proved that 15 seconds of turret traverse was an eternity. They proved that 44 feet per second was a shield more reliable than steel. And they proved that in the hands of a 26-year-old major and a crew of speed freaks from Buick, a cardboard box with a 76mm gun could make the most powerful tanks in the world look like they were standing still. The German tankers who survived the war often spoke of the grey ghost with a mixture of respect and frustration. They hadn't been beaten by a bigger tank. They had been beaten by a faster clock. The M18 Hellcat remains a reminder that in warfare, as in physics, force is not just mass, it is acceleration. And on the frozen fields of Europe, acceleration won the war. The final chapter of the Hellcat's story isn't found in the grand parades of victory, but in the quiet, analytical rooms of post-war military academies. After the dust settled, the American military faced a confusing reality. Their worst tank on paper, the one with the thinnest armor and the most criticized doctrine, had produced the most dominant results of the war. The M18 Hellcat finished the conflict with an official record of 526 confirmed kills. When you look at the exchange ratio, the numbers are even more startling. For every Hellcat lost in combat, they had taken out nearly 2.5 enemy vehicles. Compared to the standard M4 Sherman, which often struggled to break even against heavy German armor, the Hellcat was a statistical anomaly. But as the Cold War began, the speed versus armor debate took a sharp turn. The rise of the Soviet Union and their massive T-54 tank divisions led the US Army to consolidate. They moved away from specialized tank destroyers and toward the universal tank. The M18 was sold off to Allies, sent to the scrapyard, or ended up as curiosities in museums. Yet the ghost of the Hellcat's philosophy never truly died. In the decades that followed, the lessons learned by those 26-year-old majors in the Po Valley resurfaced in the development of modern active protection systems and high-mobility wheeled vehicles. The modern battlefield has become a place where even the thickest armor can be pierced by a handheld missile. Once again, the world is realizing what Andrew Bruce knew in 1941. Survival isn't about how much steel you can carry. It's about not being where the shell lands. The German Panzer crews of 1944 were the best-trained, most heavily armored force the world had ever seen. They were masters of the slugger's game, but they were broken by a machine that refused to box. They were broken by a vehicle that treated a tank battle like a high-speed chase. If you go to a military museum today and stand next to an M18, it looks small. It looks fragile. You can reach out and touch the 13mm hull and realize just how little stood between those crews and total annihilation. It was a vehicle that demanded everything from its men: total focus, absolute aggression, and a complete disregard for safety. But for those who served in them, the trade was worth it. They didn't want the comfort of a heavy tank. They wanted the math of survival. They wanted those 44 feet per second. Because in the end, the M18 Hellcat didn't just survive the Second World War, it outran it. It proved that while the Germans were building better tanks, the Americans had built a better way to fight. And as long as speed and geometry dictate the flow of battle, the legacy of the Grey Ghost will remain. German armor was the strongest in the world, but it couldn't hit what it couldn't track, and it couldn't track a Hellcat. If you found this breakdown of the M18's deadly math fascinating, make sure to hit the subscribe button and join us here at the WW2 Logbook. We're diving deep into the archives every week to bring you the technical specs, the tactical gambles, and the untold stories of the men and machines that defined the greatest conflict in history. Let us know in the comments, would you have traded the safety of a heavy tank for the speed of a Hellcat? Or was 13mm of armor just too much of a gamble? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next entry.